the prestigious Nobel Prize, often regarded as the Nobel Prize in social science and humanities. And trained in the mathematics, linguistics, and law, she has authored numerous influential works, including The Fifth Branch and The Ethics of Inventions. Her research challenges the common assumption that technology is apolitical. It's co-produced, it's co-produced with law, politics, and the culture, shaping and shaped by policies of modern democracies, institution values, and the public imaginaries. We are especially proud to note that Professor Jasanoff has been a senior advisor to EAST since our inaugural issue in 2007. And over nearly 2 decades, she has provided enduring intellectual support through the leadership of our past editors-in-chief, including Professor Fu Dawei, and Professor Jialin Wu, today's host. And also Professor Guo Wenhua, who will be the full as president in the coming months. And now myself. Beyond East, she has long-standing ties to East Asia. She was a visiting professor at Kyoto University in 1999. And she also has been an international advisor to the Nanyang Institute for Science and Technology for Humanity in Singapore since around 2019. And she also visited Taiwan on multiple occasions. The question of whether nuclear energy can be green is not just timely, but at the heart of the global debates on the energy transition, climate justice, energy resilience, and the technological governance, especially as countries today face trade tariff uncertainties in the global energy markets. This May, Taiwan officially became a nuclear-free homeland following the shutdown of the third nuclear power plants in Pingtung after its 40-year license expired. This marks a significant milestone of nuclear-free homeland policy and the fulfill of Taiwan's SDG goals pursued by the current administration. However, this is also a call for resuming nuclear power plants, and there will be a referendum in August. In the United States, nuclear energy is experiencing a comeback, particularly with Trump's deregulations in environmental and energy policy. Advocates believe that nuclear is carbon-free green energy source. Meanwhile, in Poland, construction of the country's first nuclear power plant is also scheduled for 2028. However, looking through the social culture lens, we should also bring up discussions on nuclear waste governance, the long-term risk and impacts, particularly considering the vulnerable communities that are often overlooked. STS challenges the technocratic narrative that risk assessment and management are purely scientific. Who defines the risk, who bears the risk, and how do political culture shape the way we see and respond to the risk? So the question, can nuclear be green, is therefore not simply technical. It's a question of social technical imagination, governance, ethics, and justice. In today's talk, Professor Jasanoff will reflect on recent issue in American energy policy. So please join me warmly welcoming Professor Jasanoff.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction and also for the opportunity to talk to you this morning. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be here under the joint auspices of EAST and also of the Sociology Department. I Professor or Dr. Shunling Chen, who was my co-teacher at Harvard for a couple of years, and also my advisee at the same time, has been acting as the intermediary and the person in between. And when I asked her, what do people want to hear about? She said nuclear power. And I said, but that's not what I'm working on immediately. So what can I possibly have to say about it? And nevertheless, my hand was gently forced because it is, of course, a topic of enormous importance. So with my apologies for the fact that I'm not up to date on the Taiwanese situation in a day-by-day way, even in America. Well, of course, you know, at the moment in America, what is policy today could be not policy tomorrow. So it's very difficult to have a predictive idea of what's happening in America. But nevertheless, the state of nuclear is as unstable as the state of everything else in my own country as well. So what I wanted to do was take the opportunity to talk about STS really, with nuclear as the example in the background, and not nuclear as a case study with somehow STS being applied to it. So please treat the talk partly as an invitation to reflect together. I mean, how does the arrival of a major issue, the way that you laid it out on all different dimensions, affect the way STS analysts should be confronting their academic world, but also their social world? Because I think STS is a field that has enormous importance and significance for almost everything that happens to us today. So, you know, at the sort of deepest level of my thinking, it's that invitation for us as STS scholars together to think more deeply about our role as both intellectuals and as actors in the world in a certain sense. Because I think that by looking at the world in different ways, you actually create possibilities for opening and for action that might not be obvious and available otherwise. And then I hope to come back to a lot of more detailed questions during the question and answer period. So if this shifts. Yeah, so these are just some very general questions that we could begin with as frameworks. So what you said about the phase out of nuclear power and shutting down of the last Taiwanese operating reactor makes the picture on the left quite opportune, because Austria was a country that was investing in nuclear power, and then in 1980 they had a referendum. You were about to confront a referendum. In that referendum, Austria decided not to be nuclear, and yet the power plant was built, and this is an image of that Zwentendorf power plant as a reminder that politics actually can stop technology. I mean, this is something that STS scholars often forget, because we get caught up in the fetishization of technology and we start believing that this is inevitable. Like, how many people in this room think AI is an inevitable game changer? You could ask yourselves. And yet, if you remember the nuclear case, there are things that have been stopped for at least certain periods of time, which allow us to reflect. And so I think that that's an important image to keep in mind for future questionings. But more importantly, because we are academics, we want to know how STS can contribute to the other social sciences. I don't know what the situation is in Taiwan, but the biggest opposition I have met in my long years of pioneering STS has been from the other social sciences, sociology, anthropology, history, not political science to an interesting extent. In America, political science just acts like STS doesn't exist. And as a result, the entire politics of science and technology doesn't get discussed in an academic way, because it's not happening in political science departments, and STS is not recognized by universities. So the politics of science and technology, which is like our entire lives, are unanalyzed anywhere in the world. But sociology, anthropology, and history, to some extent, want to deny that there is anything special about STS. And so STS has to keep on redefining and re-articulating what we do and why it's not quite the same as the very valuable things that history does, that sociology does, that anthropology does, and other social sciences do as well. So again, a background question for us is how to actually articulate the things that STS is good for and the things that STS is doing. And then, of course, STS is famously known as a field of case studies. So nuclear, of course, is a long-running case study. And what does nuclear have to tell us in general about STS theories and methods? That's another sort of important question. Most of us are situated in particular countries, and we know the cases of those countries, but some of us are daring enough to be involved in comparative studies. And I think I actually detect a rising interest in the generation that is mostly represented in this room in thinking in comparative ways, because many of you are no longer trained only in one country or only in one method. And so I think people come with more comparative expertise. And so I think the back and forth conversation between the national case and other country cases is something that we can think about together. And then last but not least, probably the most recurrent criticism of STS is that it does not have any normative ideas, that STS does not distinguish good and bad. STS is entirely about relativism, that we ask questions and complicate things. I've been told, I don't know how many times, oh, you STS people, you always complicate things, you never tell us what to do. All my law friends, and I have many of them, keep saying, well, if you write an article for a law review, you have to have a normative conclusion. And STS doesn't tell us what a normative conclusion is. So I think that that's all wrong, and it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what STS can do and should do. And I don't think there's any separation between STS analysis and other kinds of normative analysis. But again, it requires us to think harder and think further. And, you know, why people keep persisting in raising this ghost of relativism, I don't know. It's something that I believe I left behind a long time ago, and I hope that others in this room will too. So what can we get by looking at the nuclear case in STS ways? So some of this is, you know, almost deeply historical. One of the ways in which STS started looking at anything political was by recognizing that when people look at the same world, they don't necessarily see the same world. So people look at the same thing, but they interpret it in different ways. One of the East Asian influences that I go back to is the film Rashomon from 1950, I think was the date. And it's a film, Kurosawa's masterpiece. It's regarded as one of the major contributions to cinematography. But the intellectual heart of that film is about relativism in a way, because the same sequence of events happens, and there are 4 viewpoints from which the scene is understood in a very different way. You know, was there a rape or was there not a rape? I mean, that's one of the central questions. But who is looking at and who is experiencing those things affects the interpretation of what happened. So there is, scientists like to tell us there's a singular truth. You look at all these data points and you come out with one way of looking at things. Science is deeply dependent for its authority on saying, this is the only way, this is the only truth. The only other social institution that does that is religion. And so you can understand the fight between science and religion, because religions also like to tell you, this is the only way, this is the only truth. And so you can see science as the religion of modernity that wants to put its pathway forward as the only way. So one way that I think STS does complicate our world, especially if you look comparatively, is to show us, well, in practice, there isn't only one way, because people look at the same things and yet they do different things with it. Even when they want good outcomes or the same outcomes, they still treat it in different ways. So that's part of the guiding STS question. And way back from, in sociology, the first person who in America broke into the field of sociology by doing STS was Dorothy Nelkin. She was my senior colleague at Cornell for a long time. You may not know that she had no PhD. She had no advanced degree in anything. And yet she came to be recognized as a distinguished professor of sociology at NYU, which is a leading university, before she died. And, so it's a question how this person who had never received PhD training actually became a member of a field that she was not trained in. But her series of books from the 1970s mostly were called Controversy, plain and simple, one word, controversy. And there were different editions of it. So from the beginning, STS in America, but I think also in Europe, has been concerned with how it is that people look at the same data and yet reach different interpretations of those data. For me, comparison is one of the answers, one of the methodological answers, because what comparison gives you is the case and the control, in a sense. It gives you working societies, working frameworks in which people are actually living alternate realities. And so you can examine their reasons and their ideas and why they think this is the right way to go about doing things. So you may remember that in the wake of the Fukushima triple disaster, Germany decided to change its nuclear policy. Angela Merkel had been in favor of liberalizing nuclear power and slowing down the phase out of plants in Germany. But after that disaster, the Germans decided to backtrack and indeed to continue with the phase out. And all the science and technology people said, this is ridiculous. Germany is not an earthquake-prone country. It's not a tsunami-prone country. Why is it taking the Japanese case and interpreting it as relevant to the German case? For an STS analyst, that's the wrong way to ask the question. The right way to ask the question is, Germans believe that this is a logical and real, sensible way to go. Why do Germans believe this? Not, well, Fukushima is not the same as Berlin, and so, assuming that the Japan case has one interpretation and therefore any other interpretation has to be deviant and wrong. Instead, we as STS scholars should be applying the principle of symmetry and saying these people think that this is a logical and good way to go. Let's try to understand what makes them have this belief and not reject from the beginning that this could be a reasonable or a logical set of ways to think. So in my own recent work, I've developed, and we can discuss this later, a method that I call comparative problematization. Standard comparative analysis, of which I certainly do some, says take the case and look at how the case plays out in several different places. I say that in addition, we have to ask a different set of questions. How do people resolve certain questions about their society, and where do they try to resolve them? So, for instance, people working on reproductive rights may be wanting to resolve questions about how much autonomy should a woman have about her reproductive choices and process. But the place where it will be articulated, the kind of site where you will see this playing out, may not be the same in every society. I think it's famously and internationally known that in America, one of the flashpoints is abortion. And left-right politics, everything in America has operated around this question of should abortion be banned or not. The country in the world that's closest to America in many respects is the United Kingdom, Britain. There is pretty much no abortion politics in Britain. So where do women's reproductive freedoms crystallize in the British case? It's astonishingly non-political in Britain. So that raises a question of comparative problematization that you would miss if you just said, I want to compare abortion politics in the UK and the US. Because you would find in the UK, it's really not interesting. There isn't much abortion politics. So, why would you bother doing this? So, that's a sort of example of how to do comparative problematization, where you take the question first and then say where in empirical terms is this case playing out? Where is it interesting? And that then leads to a second layer of analysis, because then you can say, why is it manifesting in relation to these things here and not there? And then you would find that Britain has a very different understanding of women's rights related to women's bodily freedoms from the way that the US has. And that can then open our minds to asking other sociological questions about the women's movement and the history of it. I mean, so, we can also engage in different conversations as a result of following this method, in its applications. All right, so coming to the question that's the title of this talk, as you already pointed out, it is on the table and you read it in the newspapers. So this is from the end of 2024 or late in 2024. And I think the headline in the New York Times article that I've represented for you captures it all. Nuclear power was once shunned at climate talks. Now it's a rising star. So why and how did that happen? And then going further, you see that there's a kind of tacit demand-driven explanation for this. So in America, it's well known that Microsoft is wanting to restart the power plant at 3 Mile Island, which was closed down in 1979. Why? Because data centers need energy, and therefore you need to find energy that will be climate friendly, and nuclear power is the solution to that. And then this happens to be an article from the New York Times about Taiwan, which interestingly just came out while I was on my travels. I think it dates from June 19th, so it's very, very recent. And it's interesting we can come back to it from your point of view. You see that when the New York Times reads the Taiwanese case, it's in geopolitical terms, and it's all about where does Taiwan sit in relation to China, whereas within Taiwan, there's, of course, a lot of debate about the economics of chip production and to what extent Taiwan is too dependent on one economic sector and, what is the overall economic health of the country depending on. And then if you tie it to nuclear power on top of it, it raises a set of questions that has to do with Taiwanese politics, not only as seen by the US in the context of China. And so, I think that these are sort of interesting things for us to keep in mind as well. So where do I start? I start with what is, after all, not the end product, because I don't think I've reached my end quite yet, but a sort of point of stabilization that happened a few years after I left Cornell. So, since you do have a historical figure who is still able to talk and think, let me remind you that I spent 20 years at Cornell building what still remains the only STS department in one of the Ivy League universities. And then I went to Harvard. And my experience, my intellectual experience of Harvard was that Harvard was behind the times, at least the times as we knew them at Cornell. So I spent the first couple of years at Harvard saying to myself, what is it that the Cornell intellectual environment accomplished in those years? And states of knowledge that collected edited volume was a product. You will see that most of the contributors to that volume are actually former colleagues of mine from Cornell. But co-production was a self-reflection on, you know, what was it that we had accomplished. And some of my earlier edited books they all have an introduction by me, but they don't all have conclusions. States of Knowledge was, I think, the first edited volume I did where I felt that it needed a conclusion as well. And that's partly because I had interesting critical readers who wanted me to wrap up and say, well, so what is this all about, really? And so I wrote an afterword, which I think is a conversation with the other social sciences as well. And I said, look, if STS has a place in the social sciences, it has to be able to do what the social sciences expect of them. It has to be able to describe a piece of society. And we all know that in STS, we describe those pieces of society that have something to do with science and technology. We interpret science and technology so broadly that I think we end up describing the world, but nevertheless, it's the world as seen through knowledge and artifacts, power and materiality, epistemics and normativity. It's that world. So describing, that's, but we do the description in a symmetrical way. We want to see how science and technology play out in society, but also how society plays out in science and technology. So that is a specific take on description. Any field that black boxes science and technology is not STS, because we unblack box science and technology in order to produce symmetry. So that's our contribution to description. We absolutely provide explanations. We answer not only the what question, but the why and how questions. And we do that by rejecting linear progress narratives. Science doesn't always improve. Technology doesn't always improve. There are always interactions. There are controversies, as we've already discussed. So the explanatory thrust in STS is against the idea of linearity. If any of you in this room are especially devotees of actor network theory, you know that at each node in the network, Michel Calon was very precise in saying how the interaction occurs at that node. Interaction is by definition not linear, because you're always having some kind of back and forth inside the thing that you're constructing. So STS in its methods, in its explanatory methods, denies linearity. Much more controversial is whether STS can do any predicting. And I think STS can, because I think we have a theory of relative degrees of stabilization. I think we can say what things in society are more fixed and firm than what other things. In general, we know that when a thing once takes material form, it is more stable, partly because there's an entire apparatus of standardization that goes beyond it. So this kind of exercise, many of you have either seen or done if you're professors. You can give anybody a thing and say, how do you imagine it? You can get them to draw it. So for instance, you could give them a chair and say, draw a chair. But do chairs have arms or do they not have arms? How did you get to that thing, which is kind of a cross between having an arm and not having an arm, and the one that Shunling is sitting in, which has more raised arms? And then you go into a lecture hall and it can have a built-in desk in it and it's still a chair. And how do you recognize it? And then is it still a chair if it breaks when you sit in it? You know, you can ask those kinds of questions. And then instantly you're in STS territory, because if you test a chair before you put it in the market, what is the weight that you're testing for and how did you come upon it? And if it's a Chinese population as opposed to, say, a Dutch population, the standard might be different. Certainly the standard of height is different. I, at my age, have a harder time getting out of East Asian chairs than West European chairs, because West European chairs are built to a slightly higher seat height. But then when you transpose it into such things as cockpits in airplanes that also have seats, and are you standardizing for men's bodies or women's bodies? And then you get a defense secretary like the one that we have now, who wants to keep women out of the military and therefore wants to go back into the guts of the standardization and make sure that things are being standardized for his idea of what makes a virile, military force. He calls them warriors. He apparently doesn't know that more warfare is carried out by drones than people these days, but never mind. I mean, that's kind of our problem. So you see that prediction is something that STS does if it takes the idea of stabilization seriously. What is it that's getting stabilized? Is it getting stabilized through materiality or through institutions? And then from there to normativity is not a hard step, because then you can start asking, well, what should happen? And we have a huge body of work in STS, for instance, on standards that says these standards were done undemocratically or badly because they didn't take into consideration these questions and those questions. The Americans with Disabilities Act, you can see that as a kind of STS piece of legislation because it required all buildings to be modified so that they could become wheelchair accessible. And I think that idea of accessibility is now worldwide and everybody's doing it. So you see that there's a kind of normative dimension that comes out of the prediction, which in turn comes out of the explanation, which in turn comes out of the description. So you can roll the reel backward and forward if you're doing STS work. Now, I myself am more interested in social ways of stabilizing than material ways of stabilizing. I mean, the materiality, of course, matters, and I'm interested in materiality in a lot of different ways, such as in food, but I don't actually go in and analyze that, whereas I do analyze institutions, and I'm very interested in those, and that reflects, I think, my training in law particularly much. So this is where I want to emphasize that STS is absolutely not against relativism. STS recognizes that at any given moment, there are very powerful expectations at work in any society. I mean, just think of the expectations that are guiding us right now. I have never actually been in an American lecture where the introducing figure says good morning and then the audience says good morning back. I mean, so that was a social norm that I recognized because I'm coming from a ruder culture where people are less polite about the interaction, maybe. Anyway, on the other hand, I'm also from India, and in India, people probably would have, made a bow or something. So anyway, these institutional ideas are very profound and deep, and they should not be contradicted. And anybody who thinks that there's pure and simple relativism just doesn't know what they're talking about. The more important question is, why do certain things, certain ideas get so embedded that they become hard to move? And then also the opposite. Why do certain ideas that seem very embedded get moved very easily? And that's where politics comes into play. And that's something that we also have to be attuned to. So I think that a lot of the social sciences really deal with the dynamics of structure and agency. What should we take as fixed? And where do we think things make a difference? In our personal lives, I think most of us love agency and don't like structure so much. So we're continually looking for ways to express agency. But even then, we are also bound by structure. So everybody wants to excel in exams and do very well. But what are those exams? The exams are themselves a kind of structure, And in most Asian countries, there are ongoing debates about things like cheating, which is a form of agency that you don't accept against the structure of the exam. Anyway, so what I'm saying about the social sciences is that this continual interplay between things that we want fixed and things that we want to change, and our own position in trying to change things. This is, you know, part of the dynamic that we want to observe, that we want to explain, that we want to analyze. We want to say, is it good for society to have more agency or less agency? I mean, these are social science questions. So that's what I think of as constructivist structuralism, that a constructivist approach asks, how do these structures become so stable, and deals with that stability then going forward. All right, coming back to nuclear power, you know, so this is probably the single most famous historical traditional article to Artifacts of Politics. I would consider people not quite STS literate if they have never heard of this article. But, you know, I think we have a field with a history, and it requires a certain kind of literacy. And Langdon Winner famously, I mean, so note that Langdon Winner was talking about artifacts having politics long before Calon and Latour said that actants also have agency. But you could ask yourself, what's the difference between saying actants have agency and saying artifacts have politics? I mean, this is an interesting intellectual question. Anyway, but since Langdon Winner, it's been understood that nuclear power can't really be green. Because why? And, you know, one of the ideas is that nuclear power is extremely tied up with state security and state intentions. So the recent conflict in the Middle East, which remains tragic, the Israeli attacks on Iran's nuclear capability, the American bombs on Iran's nuclear capability, these are about trying to break the connection between nuclear enrichment, which Iran is not supposed to be doing for making weapons, but which Iran is allowed to do for doing nuclear power. But it shows you that this artifacts having politics has geopolitical dimensions. It remains crucially important even now. So from Winner's point of view, the alignment with state security apparatus, with black box expertise, with what in today's terms we would say lack of sustainability, because what do you do with the nuclear wastes and how do you use those? This has always been part of the argument. And then there are other names and other works that you might put in that are not US based. So Gabriel Hecht's famous book, The Radiance of France, from the turn of the century, is entirely about how French national interests got tied into the building of nuclear power. It's a work that is both STS and history of technology. It's STS because it does this co-productionist thing. It talks about an idea of the state that is built into making nuclear power in France. And then my colleagues from SPRU in Sussex, Andy Sterling and Phil Johnston, have been doing an entire body of work trying to establish that the British preoccupation with nuclear power is very intimately tied up with Britain's only claim to being, I mean, not having nuclear power, but being a nuclear power, which is the Trident nuclear submarine program. And so in their work, they have tried to show in micro detail the connections between the Trident program, which is about nation building and Britain's claim to being part of the nuclear club, and nuclear power, which they regard as a failed energy technology. So through the work of all these people, you see that this tie-in between the state and nuclear power is important. And you could take Germany in a way as an anti-case, because it's partly because of that tie-in that Germans have been so resistant to nuclear power. So it's in a way the negative of this case. I found this, I mean, this is, again, you have the benefit of a historical figure talking to you right now. I went to attend a talk by Richard Garwin, who died in May at a fairly advanced age. He was one of the leading figures of the just post Los Alamos generation. He was one of the progenitors, one of the proponents of the H-bomb, very famous physicist. He was also very devoted to the idea of nuclear power because, as you know, many of those Los Angeles physicists became strong advocates of nuclear power because they wanted the atom to be used for peaceful purposes, and they persuaded Eisenhower that this was a way to go and so forth. So in 2009, Richard Garwin gave a lecture at Harvard that I attended, and it was called Nuclear Power in the World's Energy Future. So you see the topic for today is, you know, it's like Vishnu and the Avatar. It comes back in different guises all the time. So this is one of, I mean, so Garwin, being a famous figure, has an archive, and that lecture's slides were in the archive, and I found this is one page from his slides that he presented. So what I like, I mean, so he's talking about the fact that spent fuel can be disposed of safely. And so in this slide, he's explaining why. And he says that it's a competitive technology, but in the second bullet point, note the interesting thing he says. This is a physicist, remember, a technical person, changed law and custom to permit this. Did he have a theory for how you change custom, for instance? Did he even have a theory for how you change law? I remember that at the end of the lecture, turning away from his slides, he said, so I've shown that nuclear power is eminently safe, eminently feasible. There are only two problems in the way. One is figuring out how to dispose of the wastes, and two is public opposition to the idea of nuclear power. So, you know, he saved the sociological questions for the end, but he nevertheless had ultimate confidence that you could actually change law and customs. So I hope you find that an interesting artifact. All right, so the rest of this talk, I'll try to go through a bit quicker so that we can get to discussion. A lot of STS has tried to think, how do we bring society back in? And this is not ANT, this is social construction of technological systems. And again, there are certain STS observations here that agency is not just in the materials, but in the human actors and the users, and that there is a mutual shaping that goes on. Again, talking about classical STS work. I think many people are familiar with this article from a chapter from the Baker, Scott, and Hughes collaboration on the social construction of technological systems. And you know, part of the argument was that as women stopped wearing long skirts, it became possible to imagine a different shape of the bicycle that was suited now to everybody. And Bruno Latour, to some extent, complicated that idea by saying, well, yes, the world is full of hybrids, but what we're interested in partly is the separation of those hybrids into a purely material and a purely social. And from that, I mean, of course, it's got the Latourian simplicity of graphic design, but it also has an analytic mandate embedded on the right-hand side. So in a way, Latour's life mission was to take the two separate circles on the top and return them to hybridity. So to show how the world is hybrid. You can put the Jasanoffian project as the inverse of that. I think it's actually more interesting in some ways to ask, how is it that confronted with hybridity, we nevertheless keep on reverting to type and reverting to the simplifications of the top? And it's not just the division of the natural from the social, it's everything. I mean, how do we know what law is? To me, this is these days an everyday headache, an everyday feeling that makes me genuinely sick to my stomach when I wake up in the morning and look at the newspaper, because I see the US Supreme Court behaving in ways that my training taught me were lawless. So, you know, in that sense, the question, how does one accept these arguments? And yet, being an STS scholar, I have to say, I do have to listen to these people's arguments. I have to understand how they think and why their logic makes sense to them. Because without that, I will have no place to go to counteract their logic and figure out how to build the counter logic that would be powerful. So I think that, you know, I don't make cartoons. Maybe I should go into that, or maybe East Asians with more of a cartooning mindset can actually help make the cartoon book of co-production. And I will collaborate with any of you who are artists by nature. And I want to produce the if the tour is the thesis, I want to produce the antithesis and get to, you know, why these stabilities and these ways. And maybe if we do it in Technicolor, it'll be an advance over black and white. All right, but coming back again to method, I mean, I do it comparatively, as I said, and I'll just go through this slide without talking about it in detail. But again, this involves an evolution in my own thinking. So in my earliest work in the 1990s was, in the 1980s, was together with political scientists, and I took their ideas of structuralism for granted. And so if you read Controlling Chemicals, which came out in 1985 and was my first attempt to say, why is it that looking at the same things, different societies see things in different ways? The answer is pretty structural. It's about American politics as pluralist, German politics is corporatist, British politics is consensual. I mean, so it took those structures to some extent for granted. In my own work, beginning in the 1990s and extending through to now, I started saying, no, sorry, that won't work, because every country has versions of these politics, and why certain forms of politics become more stable and standard is itself a question. So you have to see society and politics and technology and science as shaping each other or interacting with each other, which is what co-production attempts to do. And then on top of that, of course, are layered new things that happen throughout the world. So things like loss of trust in institutions, which is, you know, a big thing in America, but it's a big thing throughout the Western world. Maybe not so much actually in the Eastern world, and that then opens up certain questions for us. But how does one deal with these phenomena that seem to be historical and not embedded in very specific countries? What about phenomena like globalization? So the comparative turn has to deal with all of these kinds of ideas. And then against that backdrop, you can return to the question, why are certain things more stable than other things? And then you can look at technology as a materializing certain imaginations. So I'm sure that several of you in this room are working on women's issues and health issues and reproductive freedom issues. You can do histories of things like contraceptive pills and ask, you know, why not male contraceptives? Why only female contraceptives? I mean, you know, so what is it in the material direction of an innovation trajectory that already has built into it some ideas of who should be controlled by this technology and for what purposes? It's in that sense that I see technology as materialized social imagination, because back of the technology are certain ideas about what are the goods of the world, what are the values of the world that we're seeking to articulate in whatever sense. And so the first definition of national sociotechnical imaginaries was in that article that I wrote with Sung-Hyun Kim back in 2009, I think. But we never meant it to be restricted to nation states and their imaginations. And so we reflected and thought further and also evolved the set of questions around, well, what is this framework good for anyway? And this is something, I mean, sociotechnical imaginaries turn out to be the most popular idea I've had, other than humility. I mean, so technologies of humility and sociotechnical imaginaries, these are the things that people pick out of my work. There's a lazy way of picking it up, which is just to use the word and not use the whole paraphernalia of historical development and the questions it raises. So this slide, in a sense, says, stop to think why you're using imaginaries, that it's a set of purposes that has explanatory aims, but also normative aims. And then what are the kinds of questions that we might address? And again, that brings us squarely back into the territory of STS. So I think no other social science field actually says, what kinds of other things do people want in the world? Whereas for STS, that's an ongoing question. And, you know, in that top line where I talk about H-bombs, GM foods, greenhouse gases, etc., these are all things that we have conjured up, and you can put nuclear power in there. Why is it that we brought these things into being, and what's at stake in them? And then that leads us into the questions of power. You know, who makes those decisions? What if people don't agree? And what principles? I mean, so this is too small for you to see. But the who makes those decisions is very important these days, because I think we're going through another phase in discussions of the state. I think it's obvious to anybody looking at the world that the powerful digital companies have many of the attributes of states, and yet we keep insisting that these are private sector entities. So maybe we need a real deep rethinking of Marxism with a different idea of capital. I mean, so Karl Marx was a deep thinker. He had Engels by his side, and he had Lenin coming after, and he had a lot of powerful allies. And there were certain ideas that he propagated, but it's worth remembering that those ideas are now 200 years old, and a lot has happened in the world since Marx was alive and writing. One thing that has happened is that capital today is also immaterial. So it makes sense to talk about digital capital. And one of the kinds of questions we could be asking about the nuclear era is, supposing we let the sovereigns of digital capital also become the nuclear power plant owners and operators, how does this change the politics that Langdon Winner, Gabriel Hecht, Andy Sterling are talking about? Because they are still talking as if stateness and state security are the only things, whereas I think we have to say, no, there are other entities that are coming into the world. All right, so that means that the public-private boundary of all the boundaries that I'm interested in politically has emerged as a very salient one in doing comparative studies. With nuclear power in particular, you can see that in the US, part of the original game plan was to privatize the peaceful uses of nuclear power, partly so that people wouldn't keep making the connection between atoms for war and atoms for peace. And in my article containing the atom, I discuss in detail how that came about. But if you look at Germany and South Korea, there are very different ideas of what can be privatized and what should be privatized. And one question for discussion is, well, how does that occur in Taiwan? So in South Korea, it made no sense to talk about public versus private. In the wake of Fukushima, people have questioned what is the nature of TEPCO and how does it straddle the public-private boundaries. Now that matters to us as constitutional thinkers and as legal thinkers, because the expectations we have of private sector entities are very different from the expectations we have for public sector entities. And how we want them to reason is different. So any company in the US will tell you our prime responsibility is to our shareholders, not to the public at large, but to our shareholders. If unsustainable practices pose a threat to the profitability of the company, then we can get interested in sustainability, but only because it matters to the shareholders and because our price might go down. So Coca-Cola may suddenly start marketing itself as a green technology, not because of greenness, but because its profits might go down if it's not a sustainable company, right? So I think that the whole accountability cycle and the mechanisms are very different for public and private sector entities. I will just go over these slides as illustrations of how I try to operationalize these very abstract ideas. So what are nuclear imaginaries like? And you can ask how in a given country the risk is framed. What are the stakes? That means who are the winners and losers? What is the policy focus? Where have controversies arisen? And what ends those controversies? So this is an attempt to address those questions, and one could add the Taiwan column and ask similar kinds of things about these questions. But then what is not getting addressed is an STS question. I mean, once you've done this exercise, what is silenced? The comparison to some extent shows you that the things that are getting problematized in one place may not be getting problematized in another place. And then this is yet more simplified in the sense that it's the political foundations, but that's the next step of the analysis. Why is it that the risk is being framed this way and not this other way? So in America, risk is typically end of the line, typically framed in terms of health and safety, individual bodies, individual property. Americans are much less concerned about the risk that an innovation will benefit those who are already rich. They will come to that question with end of pipeline questions like digital divide and should we be giving subsidies to people to enlarge their access, but not should we have been doing this technological thing in the first place. We're a society that, as I think many people know, prizes free innovation at the outset, and then state controls coming into play only if the innovation is shown to be bad. But since the consequences are often much delayed, it means there's no accountability at the time of the innovation. Nobody's asking the questions there. And many STS scholars have started talking about upstream social responsibility and upstream participation, partly in order to counteract that tendency in American politics. So we can then come back with that interwoven history of STS conceptual ideas back to our set of questions and talk further, and let me end there. But let me first thank you and then leave this screen up as maybe something around which we can organize our conversation. So thank you very much.
Jasanoff, although your topic is about, like kind of climate change and, like the kind of American energy policy, but you actually, like talk about, more beyond America, and also, like give us, like kind of a very insightful analysis, during for the kind of comparative perspective on these issues, especially addressing the nuclear, this very kind of hot topic, not only in Taiwan, but I think. So now I want to, like kind of, open the floor, the question to the floors. And so if you have any questions, or any comments that you want to, raise your hand. Oh, already. So maybe first one, Professor Yang and then